The crack echoed through Westbrook Academy's library like a gunshot, followed by the sickening thud of flesh-meeting oak. Eleanor Voss stood frozen in the aftermath, her small frame trembling as she gripped the heavy wooden chair, its legs still vibrating from the impact. Blood trickled from her split lip where Kevin Rothschild's hand had connected just 5 seconds earlier. But it was Kevin who now lay sprawled across the wreckage of a study table. His spine bent at an angle that made 30 witnesses gasp in unison. 3 days before this moment that would change everything, Eleanor had been nothing more than a shadow in the corner of that same library, invisible by choice and comfortable in her anonymity. The morning sun filtered through tall windows as she settled into her usual spot, the farthest table from the entrance where the morning crowd never ventured. Her fingers traced the worn pages of a quantum physics textbook, while her other hand absently touched the military dog tags hidden beneath her oversized hoodie. The library at 7:30 a.m. was her sanctuary, a place where she could exist without the exhausting performance of teenage social interaction. The peace shattered when Kevin Rothschild entered with his usual fanfare. Designer shoes clicking against polished floors like a countdown to chaos. Son of pharmaceutical giant CEO Harrison Rothschild, Kevin moved through Westbrook Academy as if he owned it, which technically his father's donations suggested he might. Flanked by his loyal shadows, Dmitry Volkov and Bryce Hawthorne, Kevin surveyed the library with the calculating eyes of a predator selecting prey. His gaze swept past the clusters of studying students, past the rows of gleaming computers, and settled on the solitary figure hunched over ancient textbooks in the corner. If seeing someone stay completely calm while being bullied already has you hooked on what Eleanor's hiding, hit that like and subscribe button right now. And hey, if these stories about hidden strength help you feel less alone, the thanks button below genuinely helps me keep sharing them. Now watch what Kevin does next. Look what we have here, Kevin announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of entitled amusement that came from never facing consequences. He approached Eleanor's table with deliberate slowness, each step calculated to draw attention from other students who began pulling out phones with practiced subtlety. The ghost girl actually exists outside of urban legend. Eleanor didn't look up from her book, though her fingers tightened imperceptibly on the page. She had perfected the art of non-reaction over 3 years at Westbrook, understanding that acknowledgement only fed the beast of teenage cruelty. Kevin circled her table like a shark testing waters, his cologne overwhelming in its proximity, a cloud of privilege and poor choices. "I don't think I've ever heard you speak," Kevin continued, picking up one of Eleanor's notebooks and flipping through it with casual disregard for privacy, beginning to wonder if you even can. The notebook was filled with mathematical equations, but not the standard calculus their advanced placement class covered. These were different geometric patterns and force calculations that made Dmitry furrow his brow in confusion when he glanced over Kevin's shoulder. The notebook dropped back onto the table with unnecessary force, making Eleanor's pencil roll toward the edge. She caught it without looking, a movement so quick and precise that Bryce actually stepped back. Kevin noticed the reaction, his eyes narrowing with interest. In his world, people fell into 2 categories: those who bent to his will and those who needed more pressure to break. Eleanor's complete lack of response placed her in an intriguing 3rd category he hadn't encountered before. "Tomorrow," Kevin said, leaning close enough that Eleanor could smell the mint gum failing to mask the energy drink on his breath. "I want to see if ghosts can bleed." The threat hung in the air as Kevin and his crew departed, leaving Eleanor alone with the weight of what was coming. She finally looked up, her gray eyes tracking their retreat with an expression unreadable as stone. Her hand moved to the dog tags again, feeling the raised letters of a name she carried like armor. Colonel Mitchell Voss, Special Forces killed in action. The physics textbook closed with soft finality, as Eleanor began preparing for a war she'd spent 3 years avoiding. That night, Eleanor stood in her apartment's small living room, facing a wall of photographs she rarely allowed herself to study. Her father's career mapped out in images, training recruits in hand-to-hand combat, receiving commendations, teaching a much younger Eleanor how to stand, how to fall, how to redirect force into opportunity. Her mother had removed most of these photos after the funeral, but Eleanor had saved them, hidden them, preserved them like religious artifacts of a faith she was forbidden to practice. The muscle memory lived in her bones, encoded from age 6 when her father first taught her that strength wasn't about size, but about understanding leverage, momentum, and human psychology. 9 years of training ended abruptly when a training accident claimed Colonel Voss during a classified operation. Her mother's grief had crystallized into a single rule: never use what he taught you. Violence had taken him, and violence would not claim their daughter. Eleanor had honored that promise through 3 years of increasing torment at Westbrook. But Kevin's threat felt different, carried a weight that pressed against her restraint like water against a dam. The next morning arrived with unusual tension in the library. Word had spread through Westbrook's digital arteries that Kevin had chosen his newest entertainment, and students positioned themselves for optimal viewing angles while maintaining plausible deniability. Eleanor arrived at her usual time, settled into her usual seat, opened her usual book. The normally was a shield, a message that she would not be moved by anticipation of cruelty. Kevin arrived 15 minutes later with a Starbucks cup in hand, still steaming in the morning chill. He walked directly to Eleanor's table without preamble, standing behind her chair in silence for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Other students held their breath, waiting for whatever performance he had planned. The coffee tipped forward with practiced precision, cascading over Eleanor's notebook and laptop in a brown waterfall that destroyed hours of carefully transcribed notes. "Oops," Kevin said, his voice dripping false concern. "How clumsy of me. Maybe if you weren't sitting here like furniture, I would have seen you." Eleanor's response defied every expectation. She calmly closed her ruined notebook, pulled tissues from her bag, and began cleaning the mess without a word, without a flinch, without giving Kevin the reaction he craved. Her laptop, an ancient model held together with tape and hope, sparked once before dying completely. 3 years of saved assignments, college application essays, scholarship applications gone in an instant of manufactured carelessness. Dimitri laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Look at that. She really is a ghost. Can't even get angry like a real person." But Bryce noticed what the others missed. The way Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she cleaned, not with fear but with something else. Something held back by will alone. He saw her fingers flex and unfold in a pattern that looked almost like preparation, like a fighter rolling their shoulders before entering the ring. The observation unsettled him enough that he took an unconscious step backward. Kevin denied his expected entertainment, escalated his approach. He grabbed Eleanor's backpack from beside her chair, upending it onto the wet table where coffee still pulled. Books, papers, and personal items scattered across the surface, but it was a small wooden box that caught everyone's attention. It fell open on impact, revealing military medals, a folded flag, and a photograph of Eleanor with a man in uniform, both smiling at some long-ago moment of happiness. The library fell into absolute silence as Eleanor finally looked up, her gray eyes meeting Kevin's with an intensity that made him blink. For a moment, just a heartbeat, something dangerous flickered in her expression. Something that made Kevin's primitive brain scream warnings his conscious mind ignored. Then it was gone, replaced by the same blank neutrality she wore like armor. "My father's things," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but carrying in the silence. It was the first time most students had heard her speak. And the controlled calm in her tone was somehow more unnerving than anger would have been. Kevin's smile widened, sensing he'd finally found a pressure point. He picked up the photograph with fingers still sticky from his breakfast, leaving smudges across the image. "Military daddy, huh? What happened? Did he run away when he realized what a disappointment you were?" The temperature in the library seemed to drop 10 degrees. Eleanor stood slowly, each movement deliberate and contained. Students pressed record on their phones, sensing something momentous approaching. She reached for the photograph, her motion careful and non-threatening. But Kevin pulled it back, holding it above his head like a schoolyard bully with a stolen toy. "You want this?" Kevin taunted, stepping backward, finally showing some signs of life. "Come on, ghost girl. Reach for it." Eleanor didn't reach. Instead, she remained perfectly still, her voice level as a frozen lake. "He died serving his country. Put it down." The words should have ended it. Any person with basic human decency would have recognized the line crossed and retreated. But Kevin Rothschild had been raised in a world where lines were suggestions and consequences were for other people. He looked at the photograph with theatrical contemplation, then slowly, deliberately tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the library like thunder. Eleanor's entire body went rigid, her hands forming fists so tight her knuckles turned white. Dimitri and Bryce exchanged glances, suddenly aware they might have miscalculated their entertainment. The energy radiating from Eleanor's stillness felt like standing next to a compressed spring, waiting for release. There, Kevin said, dropping the torn pieces onto the coffee-soaked table. Now he's really gone. What happened next occurred in fragments, moments that witnesses would replay and debate for months afterward. Eleanor's hand moved to her neck, pulling out the dog tags she'd hidden for 3 years. She looked at them for a long moment, as if having a silent conversation with the name engraved there. Then she tucked them back under her hoodie and began collecting her ruined belongings with mechanical precision. Kevin, robbed of his explosive reaction, grew frustrated. He'd torn apart something precious and received nothing but cold control in return. His hand shot out, grabbing Eleanor's wrist as she reached for the torn photograph. "I'm not done with you yet." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "You are?" The authority in her voice made Kevin's grip loosen involuntarily. Eleanor pulled free, gathered the pieces of her father's photograph, and walked toward the exit without looking back. The library remained frozen until the door closed behind her, then erupted in whispered speculation. Kevin stood amid the wreckage of Eleanor's belongings, victory tasting strangely like defeat. Watching Eleanor sit there alone, absorbing hit after hit, while hiding military-grade combat training that she could have unleashed at any moment. What would you have done in her position? Drop a comment below. Would you have snapped sooner or kept enduring like her? The next day brought an unexpected variable into Kevin's carefully controlled ecosystem. Westbrook Academy's monthly board meeting had arrived, and with it came Harrison Rothschild himself, CEO of Rothschild Pharmaceuticals and puppeteer of more political strings than anyone cared to count. His presence transformed the school into a performance venue where every administrator and most students competed to appear worthy of his attention and inevitable donations. Kevin saw opportunity in his father's presence, a chance to demonstrate the social dominance that would one day translate into boardroom authority. He had something special planned for Eleanor Voss, something that would establish his power definitively while his father watched. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Plant evidence of academic dishonesty. Expose it publicly. Watch her crumble under institutional weight. The scheme required minimal effort. Dimitri had acquired answer keys to next week's advanced chemistry exam through channels that remained deliberately obscure. These papers now resided in Eleanor's locker, placed there through a combination of social engineering and a janitor whose gambling debts made him accommodating to certain requests. The stage was set for 11:45 a.m. when Harrison Rothschild would address the assembled student body in the main auditorium. Eleanor sensed the shift in atmosphere the moment she entered school that morning. Students who normally ignored her existence now watched with anticipation, their phones ready for whatever drama was brewing. She moved through the hallways with her usual quiet purpose, but her awareness had sharpened, tracking exits, counting potential threats, noting the unusual security presence that accompanied CEO visits. The announcement came over the intercom at 11:30 a.m., summoning all students to the auditorium for a special presentation. Eleanor filed in with the crowd, selecting a seat near the back where she could observe without being observed. The stage was set with corporate precision. Westbrook's principal, Dr. Patricia Thorne, radiating nervous energy as she introduced their distinguished guest. Harrison Rothschild commanded attention without effort, his presence filling the auditorium like smoke filling a room. He spoke about excellence, about preparing for futures that demanded exceptional performance, about the characteristics that separated leaders from followers. His eyes found his son in the crowd, a moment of acknowledgement that Kevin absorbed like sustenance. But excellence, Harrison continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed, must be paired with integrity. At Rothschild Pharmaceuticals, we have zero tolerance for dishonesty, for shortcuts, for those who would steal credit for work they didn't earn. The timing was perfect, orchestrated with precision that would have impressed a conductor. Dr. Thorne's assistant rushed onto stage, whispering urgently in her ear while holding a folder that anyone could see contained examination papers. The principal's face transformed from confusion to shock to determination in a sequence that seemed almost rehearsed. "I apologize for the interruption," Dr. Thorne announced, her voice tight with manufactured concern. "But we've just discovered evidence of serious academic misconduct that must be addressed immediately." She called Eleanor's name, each syllable falling into the auditorium like stones into still water. Eleanor stood slowly, understanding flooding through her with cold certainty. This wasn't random escalation. This was calculated destruction. She walked to the stage with her head high, refusing to provide the hunched shoulders and lowered eyes that would satisfy the audience's expectation of shame. "These examination materials were found in your locker," Dr. Thorne said, holding up the papers for the assembly to see. "Can you explain how they came to be in your possession?" Eleanor looked at the papers, then at Kevin's satisfied smirk in the third row, then at Harrison Rothschild's expression of detached interest. The trap was elegant. She had to admit denial would sound like desperation. The truth would require accusation she couldn't prove. Silence would be taken as admission. Every path led to the same destination: disgrace, expulsion, the destruction of futures that depended on scholarships she'd now never receive. "I've never seen those papers before," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone Dr. Thorne held toward her. "They were planted in my locker." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. Kevin's laugh cut through the noise, perfectly timed to sound spontaneous. "Really?" The ghost girl suddenly finds her voice just to lie. He stood addressing his father as much as the assembly. "Everyone knows Eleanor Voss would do anything for her grades. She's obsessed, antisocial, desperate for the scholarship she needs," because he paused for dramatic effect. "Well, we all know her situation. The implications hung in the air. Poor, fatherless, struggling. Everything that marked her as different from Westbrook's typical student body." Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, each judgment adding pressure to the moment. Her fingers found her father's dog tags through her shirt, the metal warm against her skin. "Mr. Rothschild is right." Harrison's voice boomed from his front row seat, standing to add gravity to his words. "Desperate people do desperate things. They take shortcuts. They cheat. They lie when caught." He looked directly at Eleanor with a cold assessment of someone examining a failed experiment. Some people simply don't belong in certain environments. The rage that Eleanor had contained for 3 years began to crack its container. Every slight, every moment of swallowed pride, every promise to her mother about avoiding violence strained against the pressure of this orchestrated humiliation. Her father had taught her to fight with honor, but he'd also taught her that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to make them understand consequences. "You're right," Eleanor said, her calm voice cutting through the assembly's murmur. "Some people don't belong here." She turned to face Kevin directly. "People who buy their grades with daddy's donations. People who destroy others for entertainment. People who mistake cruelty for strength." Kevin's face darkened as he pushed through the row to reach the aisle. He mounted the stage in 3 quick strides, his father's presence emboldening him beyond usual boundaries. Dr. Thorne stepped back, uncertain how to manage the CEO's son's involvement. Kevin stopped directly in front of Eleanor, close enough that the microphone picked up his breathing. "You need to learn your place," he said, his voice low but amplified through the sound system. "I know my place," Eleanor replied, matching his quiet intensity. "It's standing up to people like you." The slap came without additional warning, Kevin's hand connecting with Eleanor's face in a crack that echoed through the auditorium like a judge's gavel. Her head snapped to the side, blood immediately welling from where his family ring had split her lip. The assembly gasped in collective shock, phones rising like salutes to capture the moment. Harrison Rothschild's reaction was not what anyone expected. He smiled, a cold expression of approval for his son's demonstration of dominance. "Some lessons," he said into the stunned silence, "require physical reinforcement." Eleanor touched her lip, looking at the blood on her fingers with an expression that transformed from shock to something else. Something that made the nearest student step backward unconsciously. She straightened slowly, her gray eyes finding Kevin's with an intensity that made him blink. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching like heated glass. The first second, Eleanor's body shifted, weight transferring in a way that would have meant nothing to most observers, but everything to anyone trained in combat. Her shoulders relaxed even as her core tensed, the paradox of preparation that preceded explosive movement. The second, her hands moved to the heavy oak chair beside the podium, fingers wrapping around its back with a grip that spoke of purpose rather than panic. The chair weighed at least 20 lb, solid construction from an era when furniture was built to last generations. The second, the pivot began. Eleanor's entire body rotating with the kind of mechanical precision that came from thousands of hours of practice. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, teaching her about momentum, about using an opponent's expectations against them, about the surprise advantage of unexpected force. The second, Kevin's eyes widened as his brain finally processed what was happening, but his body had no time to respond. He'd expected tears, collapse, submission. He'd never imagined that the ghost girl he'd tormented for months was actually a warrior choosing not to fight. The 5th second, the chair connected with Kevin's back with a sound that would haunt witnesses' dreams. The crash of wood against spine that spoke of serious damage. His body lifted off the stage. Dew-aligned shack propelled by the perfectly transferred energy of Eleanor's strike, before crashing through the podium in an explosion of splintering wood and electronic feedback from the destroyed microphone system. The auditorium erupted into chaos as Kevin Rothschild's body came to rest amid the wreckage of the podium. His designer shirt torn and already showing the violent bloom of bruising that would mark him for weeks. His breathing came in short, panicked gasps that suggested possible rib damage, while his legs remained ominously still. Dimitri and Bryce rushed to their fallen leader, their phones forgotten in genuine terror at seeing their untouchable friend reduced to broken vulnerability. Eleanor stood motionless on the stage. The chair still gripped in her hands like a medieval weapon, blood continuing to drip from her split lip onto the polished floor. Her expression held no triumph, no regret, only a terrible calm that made even the teachers hesitate to approach. The dog tags had come free during the motion, hanging outside her hoodie where everyone could see the name that explained everything and nothing. Colonel Mitchell Voss, Special Forces. Harrison Rothschild was the first to break the paralysis, his voice cutting through the pandemonium with corporate authority. Call 911 immediately and security arrest this girl for assault. He knelt beside his son, his usual composure cracking, as Kevin moaned incoherently about numbness in his fingers. Dr. Thorne fumbled for her phone while simultaneously trying to direct the evacuation of students, who pressed against each other for better views, their cameras capturing every second of the unprecedented drama. The school's 2 security guards moved toward the stage, but their approach was cautious, uncertain how to handle a student who had just demonstrated such explosive capability. Everyone remained calm, a new voice commanded from the back of the auditorium, carrying the kind of authority that made people instinctively obey. Ms. Hazel Blackwood, Westbrook's seemingly unremarkable librarian, walked down the center aisle with purpose that transformed her entire presence. Gone was the quiet woman who reshelved books and enforced silence. In her place stood someone who moved like law enforcement, who assessed threats with professional precision. She reached into her cardigan and withdrew something that caught the light. A badge that made both security guards freeze mid-step. Special Agent Hazel Blackwood, FBI, nobody moves until I say so. The revelation hit the assembly like a second shockwave. Students looked between their librarian and the federal badge with expressions of complete incomprehension. Harrison Rothschild's face went through a spectacular transformation from rage to confusion to something that might have been fear. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, standing to face this new threat to his controlled narrative. "You can't be serious. FBI in a high school library." Agent Blackwood ignored him, moving past to mount the stage where Eleanor still stood frozen. She gently removed the chair from Eleanor's grip, setting it aside before examining the girl's injured face with professional assessment. "Are you hurt beyond the lip?" Eleanor shook her head slightly, her voice barely audible. "I broke my promise. I used what he taught me." "You defended yourself against assault," Blackwood corrected loud enough for the recording phones to capture. After sustained harassment that this institution failed to address, she turned to face the assembly, her badge held high. "I've been conducting an investigation into systematic bullying and potential criminal harassment at Westbrook Academy for the past 4 months, specifically focusing on Kevin Rothschild and his pattern of targeting vulnerable students." Harrison Rothschild's face had progressed from red to purple. "This is entrapment. My lawyers will destroy you." "Your lawyers," Blackwood replied calmly, "will be quite busy defending your son against assault charges. I have video evidence of him striking a minor without provocation in front of 500 witnesses." She gestured to the sea of phones still recording, not to mention the planted evidence in Miss Voss's locker, which I documented this morning before it could be discovered. Kevin tried to sit up from where he lay on the destroyed stage, his face contorting with pain from what would later be diagnosed as 3 herniated discs and a compression fracture. "She attacked me with a weapon. She responded to being physically assaulted with proportional force," Blackwood countered. "Your strike came first, unprovoked, after a sustained campaign of harassment that I've thoroughly documented, including yesterday's destruction of military memorabilia belonging to a Gold Star family." The mention of Gold Star family sent a ripple through the crowd. Students who had laughed at Eleanor's suffering yesterday now looked uncomfortable, ashamed. The narrative was shifting beneath their feet. transforming from entertainment to something darker, something that implicated them all in their silence. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice carrying in the hushed auditorium. My father died in Operation Ghost Strike. Classified mission, Syrian border. He was trying to save 3 captured aid workers when his position was compromised. She looked directly at Harrison Rothschild. He died believing that protecting the innocent was worth any sacrifice. Your son has spent 3 years proving that some people see innocence as weakness to exploit. Principal Thorne had been silent throughout the exchange, but now stepped forward with the careful movements of someone navigating a minefield. Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately away from the students. No, Blackwood said firmly. This happened publicly. The consequences will be public. She pulled out her phone. Speaking to someone on speed dial. This is Agent Blackwood. I need backup at Westbrook Academy. We have assault charges to file and evidence to collect. The next 20 minutes passed in surreal fragments. Paramedics arrived to stabilize Kevin's spine before carefully loading him onto a gurney, his moans of pain echoing through the auditorium. Local police took statements while FBI agents began collecting phones that contained evidence. Harrison Rothschild made frantic calls to lawyers who gave him increasingly grim assessments of the situation. Eleanor was escorted to the nurse's office to have her lip properly treated, Agent Blackwood staying beside her like a protective shadow. As they walked through the halls, students pressed against classroom windows to watch, their expressions ranging from awe to fear to something like respect. How long have you known? Eleanor asked as the nurse applied butterfly bandages to her split lip. Since your first week, Blackwood admitted. I pulled your father's service record when you enrolled. Mitchell Voss was a legend in certain circles. When I learned his daughter was being systematically tormented while hiding combat training that could end it instantly, I knew I had to document everything. You could have stopped it sooner. I could have stopped Kevin sooner, Blackwood agreed. But not the system that created him. His father has been using Rothschild Pharmaceuticals' influence to cover up Kevin's escalating violence for years. 3 students attempted suicide after his campaigns against them. 2 families were paid off. 1 moved to another state. She paused, meeting Eleanor's eyes. I needed evidence of something undeniable, something that would stick even against their legal team. Eleanor touched her father's dog tags, understanding flooding through her. You were using me as bait. I was documenting a pattern that would eventually explode. I just didn't expect it to be quite so spectacular. Blackwood's expression softened slightly. Your father would be proud. You showed more restraint than most trained soldiers would have managed. Through the nurse's office window, Eleanor could see news vans already gathering in the parking lot. Someone had leaked the video, and Shy Girl Destroys Bully with Chair was trending across social media platforms before Kevin's ambulance reached the hospital. Rothschild Pharmaceuticals' stock price began dropping as investors processed the optics of their CEO defending his son's assault of a Gold Star family's daughter. The school day ended in unprecedented chaos. Parents arrived to collect children who excitedly recounted witnessing history. Teachers huddled in confused clusters, trying to understand how their librarian had been federal law enforcement. Kevin's remaining friends discovered the temporary nature of power when authority crumbles, finding themselves suddenly isolated as students distanced themselves from potential legal consequences. Eleanor's mother arrived at 4:00 p.m., her face a storm of emotions that Eleanor couldn't fully read. Jennifer Voss was a small woman who had somehow become smaller since her husband's death. As if grief had physically diminished her, she stood in the principal's office doorway, taking in her daughter's bandaged face. The FBI agents, the lawyers already circling like vultures. You used it, she said simply. The violence he taught you. I'm sorry, Eleanor began, but her mother crossed the room in quick steps, pulling her into an embrace that smelled of vanilla extract and the bakery where she worked double shifts to afford Westbrook's supplemental fees. Don't apologize, her mother whispered fiercely. Your father taught you to protect yourself when I couldn't. I was wrong to make you hide it. She pulled back, examining Eleanor's face with gentle fingers. Mitchell would have done exactly the same thing, except Kevin would be in worse condition. Agent Blackwood provided a business card to Jennifer Voss. The FBI will ensure Eleanor faces no legal consequences. She was defending herself against documented assault. However, you may want to consider transferring schools. The attention this will generate could be overwhelming. But Eleanor shook her head slowly. I'm not running. Not anymore. They need to see that fighting back is possible. The next week passed in a blur of legal procedures and media attention. Kevin Rothschild's injuries proved severe enough to require surgery, though he would eventually recover most function with extensive physical therapy. The viral video had been analyzed by combat experts who marveled at Eleanor's technique, noting the perfect kinetic chain that had transferred maximum force while minimizing risk to her own body. Some called it luck. Those who understood biomechanics called it mastery. Harrison Rothschild's efforts to control the narrative failed spectacularly. Every attempt to paint Eleanor as dangerous was countered by the months of harassment Agent Blackwood had documented. Screenshots of Kevin's deleted social media posts surfaced, showing a pattern of cruelty that extended far beyond Westbrook. Former victims came forward with their own stories, their own scars. The lawsuit Rothschild Pharmaceuticals filed against Eleanor was withdrawn within 48 hours when their legal team explained the catastrophic publicity that would result from a billionaire corporation attacking a Gold Star family's teenage daughter. Eleanor returned to Westbrook the following Monday, walking through the front doors into a fundamentally changed environment. The hallway parted before her like a biblical sea, students stepping aside with expressions of wary respect. She made her way to the library to her corner table that someone had cleared of any trace of the coffee incident and opened her quantum physics textbook as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Students who had ignored her for 3 years now nodded acknowledgement when they passed. Teachers who had overlooked the bullying now checked on her with guilty frequency. Dimitri and Bryce, abandoned by their fallen leader power, avoided her completely, taking elaborate routes to avoid crossing her path. The library itself felt different with Agent Blackwood gone, returned to wherever FBI agents went when their covers were blown. A new librarian, young and nervous, jumped whenever Eleanor entered, as if expecting another explosive revelation. Eleanor missed Blackwood's steady presence, the sense that someone was watching who actually understood the weight of carrying violence in your bones while choosing peace. 3 weeks after the incident, as autumn began painting Connecticut in shades of fire, Eleanor sat in her usual spot finishing a scholarship application essay. The topic asked about overcoming adversity, and she found herself writing about her father, about the burden of strength, about the choice between capability and action. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the same precision she'd used to swing that chair. Each word carefully selected for maximum impact. The afternoon sun slanted through the library windows, casting long shadows across empty tables. Most students had left for the day, pursuing their after-school activities and social lives that Eleanor still had no interest in joining. She preferred the solitude, the space to exist without performance or expectation. The incident with Kevin hadn't made her social. It had simply made her visible. She packed her belongings carefully into the same backpack Kevin had emptied onto that coffee-soaked table. The torn photograph of her and her father had been carefully taped back together, now laminated and tucked into a pocket next to his service medals. These artifacts of loss had become talismans of survival, reminders that some things broken could still hold meaning. The walk to her locker was uneventful. The hallways empty except for the distant sound of basketball practice echoing from the gym. Eleanor spun her combination lock with practiced ease, the metal door swinging open to reveal textbooks and notebooks arranged with military precision. She reached for her history text, planning to study for tomorrow's exam, when her fingers brushed something that shouldn't be there. A black envelope, expensive paper that felt like silk against her fingertips, no name on the outside, no indication of how it had appeared in her locked locker. Eleanor glanced down the empty hallway, suddenly aware of how isolated she was. How vulnerable despite all her training. She pulled out the envelope. Noting its weight suggested something more than just paper inside. The seal was black wax, impressed with a symbol that made her blood run cold. A serpent coiled around a dagger. She'd seen that symbol exactly once before in a classified briefing her father had shown her when she was 12, explaining why his work was dangerous, why they had to be careful, why some enemies never forgot. Inside was a single black card. No text, no identification, just the raised symbol that seemed to writhe in the fluorescent lighting. Behind the card was a photograph she'd never seen before. Her father in combat gear standing next to 3 other soldiers, their faces obscured by tactical masks, but one of them had a tattoo visible on his forearm. The same serpent and dagger that marked the card. Eleanor's phone buzzed with an unknown number. The text was brief. Ghost Strike remembers its deaths. She spun around, searching the empty hallway for any sign of observation. The security cameras that should have been recording showed only static on the monitoring station visible through the office window. Someone had been here. Someone with the skill to bypass locks and surveillance. Someone who knew about her father's final mission. Another text arrived. Your father should have stayed dead. The implications hit Eleanor like physical blows. Her father's death, classified as a training accident, might not have been accidental. The operation he died on, the one that saved 3 aid workers, might have had complications that were never reported. And someone somewhere believed Eleanor either knew something or owed something related to that night. She grabbed her backpack and moved quickly toward the exit, her trained awareness cataloging every shadow, every corner where someone could hide. The parking lot was bathed in dying sunlight, empty except for a few teacher vehicles and her mother's ancient Honda waiting in the pickup lane. As Eleanor reached for the car door, she noticed something that made her freeze. In the reflection of the window, barely visible in the glare of sunset, stood a figure on the school's roof, tall, dressed in black, watching. When she turned to look directly, no one was there. The roof was empty except for ventilation units and the American flag snapping in the autumn wind. She got into the car, her mother immediately noticing her tension. What's wrong? Eleanor wanted to tell her everything about the card, the texts, the figure that might or might not have been on the roof. But looking at her mother's tired face, the new lines that 3 years of widowhood had carved, she couldn't add this weight. Not yet. Not until she understood what was happening. Nothing, Eleanor lied, tucking the black card into her pocket where it seemed to burn against her palm. Just tired. As they drove away from Westbrook Academy, Eleanor watched the side mirror intently. 3 cars back, a black SUV with tinted windows maintained perfect following distance, professional enough to be almost invisible. When her mother turned left toward their apartment, the SUV continued straight, disappearing into traffic as if it had never existed. That night, Eleanor lay awake, studying the photograph, searching for clues in the tactical gear, the background, anything that might explain why someone was reaching out. Now, the serpent and dagger symbol had been digitally scrubbed from military databases, she discovered, existing only in fragments and rumors about a unit that officially never existed. Her phone sat silent on the nightstand, no more mysterious messages arriving. But Eleanor knew with cold certainty that this was just the beginning. The violence she'd unleashed on Kevin Rothschild had been observed by someone who saw it not as self-defense, but as activation, as proof that Colonel Mitchell Voss's daughter had inherited more than just his combat training. Outside her window, autumn wind rattled the fire escape, and every sound made her wonder if someone was climbing toward her 3rd floor or apartment. The chair incident had ended one chapter of her life, the chapter where she could hide in plain sight. Now something else was beginning. Something that connected to her father's death and the classified operation that had stolen him from her. Eleanor touched the dog tags at her throat, feeling the raised letters of her father's name. Whatever was coming, whatever debt Ghost Strike believed she owed, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through 3 years of torment. She had been trained by the best, tested by cruelty and proven by violence. The ghost girl of Westbrook Academy was gone. In her place stood someone dangerous, someone ready, someone who understood that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, and the only way forward is through whatever darkness it brings with it. Eleanor touched the dog tags at her throat, feeling the raised letters of her father's name. Whatever was coming, whatever debt Ghost Strike believed she owed, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through 3 years of torment. She had been trained by the best, tested by cruelty and proven by violence. The ghost girl of Westbrook Academy was gone. In her place stood someone dangerous, someone ready, someone who understood that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, and the only way forward is through whatever darkness it brings with it. Her laptop screen suddenly flickered to life without being touched, displaying a single line of code that shouldn't exist. Coordinates that meant nothing to anyone except those who knew the location where Colonel Mitchell Voss had supposedly died. The screen went dark again before Eleanor could screenshot it, leaving only the ghostly afterimage burning in her retinas. From somewhere in the apartment building, a door slammed. Then another. The pattern was too regular to be coincidence, too deliberate to ignore. Someone was checking each unit, moving systematically upward. Eleanor counted the floors first, second, and silence. They had stopped just below her. She moved to her closet, pushing aside winter coats to reveal the small safe her father had installed years ago. Inside lay his service weapon, maintained and loaded, waiting for a moment he'd hoped would never come. Eleanor had never touched it since his death, honoring her mother's wishes. But promises made in grief sometimes shattered against the sharp edges of necessity. The fire escape creaked once, metal adjusting to temperature change or to weight that shouldn't be there. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the safe's combination lock. Whatever Ghost Strike was, whoever was hunting her father's ghost through his daughter, they had made one critical error. They assumed Eleanor was still running from violence, still the frightened girl hiding behind books and silence. They hadn't seen her transform Kevin Roth's child from predator to victim in 5 seconds of calculated fury. They didn't know that Colonel Voss had taught his daughter more than just combat techniques. He taught her that sometimes the hunted must become the hunter. And Eleanor Voss was done being anyone's prey. The black card in her pocket seemed to pulse with malevolent promise as somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, a shadow moved against shadows and the real game finally began.